Before we start, though, I do want to recognize that we're actually the guests in the original homeland of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many indigenous people who call this land home. The War of 1812, our story, I like context as a historian. The War of 1812 triggered an energy crisis in America. The east coast of North America had been heavily settled, everything east of the Appalachians, heavily settled since the 17th century. So we did not have enough timber resources for both building, things like this, and burning. We were relying on coal. And the only way we got our coal was the Atlantic Ocean. Either from the Brits directly, it was cheaper to buy it and ship it across the Atlantic. Virginia coal was available, but the only way that got to market was via the Atlantic Ocean. So the War of 1812 comes in, the British Navy still rules the oceans, therefore we could not get coal. 3/4 of all the world's anthracite coal is in northeastern Pennsylvania, an astounding statistic. 3/4, can you imagine? Anthracite, a harder coal, people had to learn how to burn it, but they eventually did. In the interest of keeping on topic, I won't go too far down that rabbit hole unless people have questions. The Wirtz brothers, Morris and William in particular, there's also Charles and John, but Morris and William were dry good merchants in Philadelphia. They were good Quakers. They got a contract from the U.S. government to supply uniforms for the War of 1812. The U.S. government didn't have enough cash. That never happens, right? They didn't have enough cash, so they actually gave the Wirtz brothers coal-bearing land, anthracite coal lands in this northeastern field. And the brothers got some coal down to down the Delaware River, down to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, but the Lehigh Valley and Schuylkill, or I never pronounce that right, Schuylkill? What is it?
Schuylkill.
It is Schuylkill, thank you. I've heard it pronounced differently, so now I never know, right? Those fields, they were closer, and so their transportation costs were lower. At this point in time in American history, canals were the best way to build a transportation infrastructure in a land that had been settled by people who had a much different relationship with the land. They didn't build, we didn't have the Roman roads. They used one-way waterways. They used native trails. They looked at the world differently. The indigenous peoples didn't, the idea of land ownership was foreign to them. Hubris, in fact. No, they did not own land. They didn't even have that concept. And it's something hard for we European interlopers to wrap our brains around. But a lot of the problems with the indigenous people are based on that huge misunderstanding. Canals become, in America, we have canal fever. Canals have been around, the Chinese were building them millennia ago. As we'll see, by the 15th century, they were a fairly common thing. Think of Amsterdam, right? Think of Holland. Here in America, they had a special place. They were the best way to build a transportation, the most cost-effective way to build a transportation infrastructure as railroads ascended. So there's really a 50-year period. In that time, America spends over $1 billion in 19th century dollars building canals. That's how important canal was. We call it infrastructure today. They called them internal improvements back in the day. On this top row here, we've got 4 gentlemen, Benjamin Wright, John Jervis, James McEntee, and James Archibald. They're all basically self-taught engineers. Benjamin Wright is considered the father of civil engineering, American civil engineering. He was the chief engineer by the end of the Erie Canal. He was the chief engineer for the entire thing. And these 3 other gentlemen, John Jervis, James McEntee, and James Archibald, all learned engineering inspired by Benjamin Wright. And so those 4 gentlemen are important to the story of the D&H because Benjamin Wright brings them over to work on it. In fact, I'm fond of saying I think the only thing Benjamin Wright actually physically did was to show Philip Hone where to dig when they had the groundbreaking in July 13th of 1825. Next year, Mama Kading will be celebrating that with a big event. The DHTHC, of which I'm president, we're fostering. We've got the 200th anniversary of the D&H and its gravity railroad. There'll be a lot of exciting events, but that's going to be one of the best ones. You folks here in Mama Kading, you've got the king of them all. So these other gentlemen were really important to the D&H, and I'll allude to them occasionally. Russell Farnham Lord was the third chief engineer, longest serving and an important. He wasn't a brilliant engineer like the guys on the top, but he was immensely important because he really ran the whole show. He oversaw its development and its enlargement, as we'll see. And John Roebling won't come into our story too much today, but I can't talk about the D&H without mentioning him. You have to come back August 31st and hear Paul King talk about John Roebling. Paul knows more about John Roebling than anybody I know, and if I know anything about him, it's because of my friendship with Paul. So the D&H Canal Company, Benjamin Wright, he sends other people out to do a survey. They survey a route that probably William Wirtz was the first one to do it. In fact, with Josiah White of the Lehigh in Delaware, back, I think that was 1824. They figure out the route of the canal, and it's going to cost $1.5 million. In fact, with its gravity railroad, it wound up being $2 million total when they were done. That $1.5 million would be some $30 million in today's dollars. Always hard to parse. Where are they going to get that money? They raise it on Wall Street. The Tontine Coffee House on Wall Street was a place, coffee houses in 18th and 19th, early 19th century America were places, also in Europe, I believe, places where people who had money would go find investment opportunities. Interestingly enough, the New York Stock Exchange met in the Tontine and sort of signaled it stopped being a center of financial activity within a couple of years of this event. But on January 7th of 1825, they don't raise the money per se, but they get people to commit to buying $1.5 million worth of stock. This makes it the first $1 million private enterprise in American history. Some historians, because they like to argue amongst themselves, some historians say, oh, no, they took public money. Show me a business that doesn't take public money. They took 2 different bond issues from the state of New York, which they paid back. It's the same as borrowing from a bank. I still call it the first $1 million private enterprise. They get 5% down, and with $75,000, they build this amazing transportation network. Let's see if my screen's going to do it. This is a great 1824 map. We're going to take a little closer look at it in a couple slides. Kind of the Magna Carta of the D&H. It came from a New York State engineer's report, positing the D&H Canal. They build this in 2.5, 3 years through largely wilderness. Whole towns spring up when they announce it, because everybody knows having a transportation network is really going to be, now you have a market, now you can send stuff up to market. Savvy landowners would actually give land to the canal company knowing that the properties adjacent would skyrocket in value. I like to call the D&H Canal and its gravity railroad a 19th century engine of prosperity. So they're employing 2,500 men and 200 teams of draft animals just in the first 50-mile long section. These people are making $12 to $14 a month. They're almost entirely Irish immigrants. This canal couldn't have been built without immigrants. It couldn't have been operated without immigrants, people of color, women and children. But the construction was almost entirely Irish. They would fight with other groups, including Irishmen from other towns back in Ireland, to keep the work themselves. At this point, I always like to point out immigrants are nothing but a net positive in America. There were jobs the naturalized folks didn't want then. It's true today too, but we won't go into that. We'll just leave that there. So what's a lock? When we were starting to design our new museum that opened 2 years ago, we conferred with a lot of people, and some of them said, do people really know what a lock is? So they wanted me to explain it to people. I very often just ask people what a lock is. Most people actually know what a lock is. It's a way to get boats up. Water wants to stay at its own level, but you're going through mountainous country, and so you need a way to raise boats and lower boats, and that's what a lock does. And just for give you an idea what they were up against, Honesdale, Pennsylvania, as we'll see in the next map, was the start of navigation. The gravity railroad was 17 miles further up over the mountains. That's why they needed the gravity railroad. We won't talk much about that today, but I like to keep that as part of the story. Honesdale's at 981 foot above sea level. Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania is 633. So each lock on the D&H Canal had a lift of about 10 foot. And so a lock is, as we'll see a little later in the presentation, you'll see how they work if you didn't know. So they had to go down, so they're locking down along the Lackawaxen River to Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. So they got to go, 350 feet. So there was indeed 36 locks originally, each with about 10 foot. They continue locking down to Port Jervis. which is at 400 foot. Then they start locking back up. Cutterbackville, 17 miles down the canal, almost exactly from here. The 17-mile summit level at 558 feet, and here we're at 548 feet, which you got to scratch your head. These are numbers I picked up off the internet, but obviously this whole section from here down to Cutterbackville was all one level. Kind of amazing that they could figure out how to do that with the fairly rudimentary technology of the day, but they did it, and its success is proof of that, isn't it? So we're at Summitville, and then they had to drop. So from this point, they're locking down. So there's 50 locks from here to the Hudson River. They're still 80 miles from their intended market of New York City. But topography is king if you're building a canal. And let's see if you're going to do that for me. And so here we have a lock. So you needed, originally the D&H Canal had 110 locks. And this is how they operated. You had a pair of what we call miter gates. And so you have a chamber, it's filled with water. On the high end, the boat floats in. We'll see this in more detail a little later. So I'll save it for that slide. But a point I'm just tickled by is that the miter gate was invented by Leonardo da Vinci in 1500. So this is how old canal technology was. And I always like to point out, it seems all obvious to us today, but it takes a genius like Leonardo da Vinci. It's a simple concept. I love this drawing. So we'll see a bunch of Ed D. Leroy's drawings. He was the first secondary source historian, wrote his first history of the Delaware and Hudson Canal back in 1950. He's got some mistakes. He doesn't have the resources I'm fortunate enough to have today. But overall, his drawings are wonderful. But here's this really good. It's like an arch, isn't it? Right? It's got an arch. If you made the gates like this, they'd fail. The hydrostatic pressure would be way too much. But by putting them at an angle, that simple thing, it keeps the locks watertight. A genius idea. It seems very, very obvious to you and I, but it took a genius like Leonardo to actually develop it. The pictures you'll see today are going to all be probably post-Civil War era, so we'll only see boats and locks from that era. And this image, I've been staring at it. I just pulled this up this week. I'm not sure what lock. This is a rare instance of me not knowing exactly which lock this is. But we have such great images. I'd love to share them with people. You don't need to look at me. You want to look at the screen, right? And here's what one of Manville Wakefield wrote. One of the was another secondary source historian, a founding member of the museum that I work at, that I'll mention at the end of the talk. And we have most of his research paperwork, most of his excellent drawings. Manville Wakefield was the Sullivan County historian back in the 50s and 60s, and taught art. He was a really talented artist. So here's a more detailed view of what the lock. This would be a detailed view of the kind of lock we have in High Falls. I'll get into that in a minute. But because it's all stone, that was atypical, in fact. So here we've got a little crop of that 1824 map. I was really fortunate to find this map. I bought it on eBay. I found some great stuff on eBay. What did historians do before the internet? Huh? How did you find stuff? How did we find information? But the most fascinating thing to me about this is, if you look there, we've got the forks that. Well, my pointer. Yeah, no, I can't get a pointer on it. Oops. Instead, I've done that. Let me move back 1 second. Good thing I've got this. I'm going to actually get in front. I said I wouldn't do this. The forks of the Dyeberry right here is where Honesdale was. It followed the Lackawaxen River to the Delaware, crossed the Delaware. Their original plan, the Wirtz brothers got the right to improve the navigation on the Lackawaxen River, move obstructions, make it so that they could send their product down it. But from this map, we see they were just going to be all on regular water until right here, roughly Sparrow Bush. And then if you look really carefully, that's where their canal in 1824, that's what they posited. I always scratch my head and say, how are they going to get the boats back up? Here they've got the problem of one-way waterways already. They were going to rely on one-way waterways, or they thought. They quickly abandoned this plan. But it's just interesting to note, and it sort of informs the way things were built. I love maps, and you can learn so much from them. And we're so fortunate to have digital copies of them. I have all of the original company maps. You'll see one of them in this talk that Paul actually helped us get from the people, the Canadians that bought out the D&H. They're an immensely important resource. We've identified 420 extant features on the D&H Canal, and the new listing in the National Register will call all of them out. It's a 40-page document. I'm actually writing a guidebook based on that document for folks like yourselves who might want to go out and see what's out there. 420, I think I've been to 380 of them. Well, I haven't counted, but I've been to the vast majority, and I'm going to go to the rest of them, folks, if I live long enough. So this is the final route of the D&H Canal. You built canals and river valleys for a variety of reasons. One is you want to minimize how many locks. The Erie Canal traversed 365 miles that only needed 85 locks. The Mohawk River Valley was the only spot in the Appalachians below 500 foot of elevation above sea level. It's where nature gave you a chance. The Appalachians stretched from Georgia all the way to Canada. The Erie Canal was immensely important both for training engineers and proving to Americans that canals actually were cost effective. But it's an important bit of American history. But the D&H was just as important. So you built in river valleys so that you could go the longest level. You want to minimize how many locks. Locks are going to cost you in manpower, they're going to cost you in water, and they're going to cost you in time. All things that you want to be efficient about. But the original D&H Canal had 110 locks to traverse those elevations that I had on that earlier slide. The original canal was 108 miles long, 4 foot deep, 32 foot wide at the bottom, 32 foot wide at the top, 16 to 20 at the bottom. Eventually, as we'll see a little later here, 6 foot deep and 32 to 50 foot wide at the top. But as you can see, there's the route, and it's the big star is more or less where we all are, basically where Summitville is there.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So when they deepened the canal to 6 feet, what they do about the invert of the existing lots?
Oh, we'll get to that. Thank you. I love foreshadowing. This is really great. You set me up. In the interest of, I'll talk about that when we get there a little bit. But yes, that's a. Okay, here we go. Come on. Just a great image of Ellenville. This would be in the latter period, as I say. Most of these images are going to be post-Civil War. We'll see two more views of this particular, not for any reason, but I happen to have. So some places I got no pictures of. People are constantly, oh, do you have a picture of my? But then there's other places like Ellenville that were popular enough where we have a lot of images. You know. So the very first locks, remember, they're only going to build down to the canal's only going to Sparrow Bush, basically. They build 60 locks, and they go back and forth because we're worried about cost. You know, this is a capitalistic enterprise. At first, I think they quote for stone, then they say, well, composite locks, and I'll get to that in a second. But the very first 60 locks from Rondout, New York to Port Jervis were made of hammered stone. And I'm not sure what that phrase exactly means, but you can see here, these were, I believe, completely stone. And unlike later stone, these were actually cemented together. I was fortunate enough recently to do a historic mortar analysis. We happen to have in High Falls these earlier locks. When I get to the point about what they did with the prism and the locks, they had to rebuild the locks after the final enlargement. But we knew from the lore they discovered Rosendale cement, natural cement. That was discovered on the D&H Canal by a geologist. There's other stories out there that are erroneous, and I can give you the proof. But we recently did a historic analysis because we need to repair one of the ones that's on one of our properties. Not surprisingly, I can say definitively, I reached way into those locks. It's Rosendale cement. It's natural hydraulic cement. A question?
Maybe the hammer stone just means that's how they shaped it, maybe?
Yeah, no, that's my. I always like to have something there. That's my surmise as well. You know, it's there in the historic record. I'm working on a pair of books, the guidebook, based on the National Register, and I'm up to about 1830 in my history of the D&H, and it's fascinating how they go back and forth with these different. So they build these first 60 of hammered stone, and we have. We have parts of 4 of them still extant, all in High Falls, so they're in my backyard. And that's where these images came from, and that's where I got the samples. I sampled from 2 different locks, and not surprisingly, Rosendale cement. But now if we want to restore them, I can go to SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and say we're going to use hydraulic cement, because that's what they used, and we'd have to do that, basically. But composite locks, So they go back and forth. They're going to make them a stone. They're going to make them composite. They go back to stone for the first 60. But when they realize that they're going to need to build a canal all the way to Honesdale, they go, oh, this is going to be too expensive. So they go to composite locks. So the lock you have right here was a composite lock. And composite locks are made of dry-laid stone, like you or I would make a stone wall with no training whatsoever, not watertight. They get lined with about 2-inch thick white oak to make them watertight. And so here's a wonderful image of that same lock in Ellenville, and it's the best image I have of what the cut stone or what the composite locks look like. Eventually, after the final enlargement, it's 98 composite locks, including your lock here. And this is just, I like to have a little color, right? This is a Lee Grand Botsford painting of that same place. Of note here is that on the left is a dry dock that was right there. This is all gone and buried now, but this particular painting by Lee Grand Botsford, the Hermit of Cragsmoor, those of you who know the arts colony up in the mountains above Ellenville, on display. 3 of his paintings, including this one, are at the D&H Canal Museum in High Falls. And you can come visit it. You can buy a copy of that too.
That was Ellenville?
That was yes, that was Ellenville, the same lock 31. It took me a minute to remember where I was there. This is great. Ed Leroy somehow in the 1940s and 50s got a hold of original blueprints. These are probably based on John Jervis drawings. Professor King has located, there's an archive that allegedly has these D&H drawings. We've got to get them. We've got to get them. I got to get them. But this is, Ed Leroy, like Manville Wakefield, was a talented artist. And this is a blueprint. This is in my collections. This is an original of his. If you look carefully, it's a reproduction from the original plans. These plans are undated, but undoubtedly were drawn no later than 1827. And on the right is a history in the latter part, I think 1908. Composite locks were constructed with stone backing lined with successive layers of plank, tree-nailed to each other, each layer to be laid across the grain of the previous one and embedded in pitch, which were advocated for economical reasons. So it's not surprising the company went back and forth in the first 2 years. Oh, composite. Well, we'll make them out of hammer. Oh, wait, we're going to make them out of composite again. But as we'll see, that didn't even hold completely. Great drawing. We're fortunate somebody donated 5 of his framed things, and one of which, not this one, but one of which is on display. Once they got going, they were immensely successful. They're the largest coal company in America by 1850, and the second largest is the PA Coal Company, which started as a friendly rival by D&H people, but ultimately sort of went bad, we'll just say. I just love this picture. This is in Rosendale, New York. I usually like to put it if I don't. This is a famous boat, the Iowa. I just love that picture. Here they say 2,000 boatmen, chiefly foreigners and men who, with rare exception, follow the canal for life. That's in 1878. At its peak, there were 5,000 people. And they say men, but in fact, from my research, I find there were 6- and 7-year-old mule drivers. They might work up to by 10 or 11 to be the bowmen. There were 3-person crews. Boat captains at 15 and 16 with like a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old. When I do child labor on the D&H Canal, I sort of go, you kind of can't call them kids. They're doing a man's work. And this is not just one story. I've got 8 or 9 stories. We're fortunate that the court case, when PA Coal and the D&H fell apart, there's 5,000 pages of testimony. The D&H wins, but they never collect. The PA Coal just takes their traffic to the Erie Railroad. But fortunately for us, I can say many things definitively, as we'll see, based on that court case. I've read it once, and I'm due to reread it. So in 1842, so it takes them about a decade to get successful. America needed the coal, but there were problems. One contemporary source says 1840 was their first successful year. At that point, by the way, John Wirtz becomes their president in 1830. He's their 3rd president, but he's the guy that they credit with making them prosperous. So they want to get more coal to market. They're a coal company. There are many other industries that use the canal, but the coal is the important thing, isn't it? Certainly for them, that's their stated goal is to market coal. They get into a lot of sidelines, but they're a coal company even into the 20th century when they're just a railroad. They increase it to 5 feet. They're so happy with that, they make it to 5.5 feet. And that gets these same 70-foot by 9-foot wide boats now carry 50 tons of coal. So they go from 30 tons to 50 tons. But for a variety of reasons, including this fact that they're the largest coal companies in America and they're bringing PA Coal's traffic, they'd taken a final enlargement between 1847 and 1852. This starts with the building of 2 suspension aqueducts by John Roebling over the Lackawaxen and Delaware rivers to replace a rope ferry. So you have to all come on August 31st. You're going to talk about it, I hope, Paul. You have to all come on August 31st and hear Paul's excellent talk. Maybe we can manage to video record that too, Paul. We'll have to talk. So eventually, 15-foot wide, 91-foot long, 90 to 91, it's a little side story. The canal is now 32-foot to 50-foot wide, and they start carrying 130 tons of coal. And as I say, once they get successful, they get up to 1,000 coal boats in their most successful. 1,000 coal boats and another 300 boats just carrying other materials and other industries. And they foster a whole bunch of other industries. But that's another talk. Here in High Falls, they're in High Falls. I live in High Falls, so I keep forgetting where I am. They had another issue. The route was so serpentine, so I don't know if you could see this. This is two and a little bit of the original company maps that we're so fortunate to have. What you're seeing is the upper route following the rondout was the original configuration. As you get closer, if you get past that bend, some of the locks were too close together. I got to get out and measure them. When they went to these longer boats, they also undertook an amazing project and rerouted the canal in High Falls. It was the deep cut. They were digging 40 and 50 foot of material. When I do free tours, which I do 4 times a year, September, I'll be doing 2 free tours at the museum. You can check my website for that. I point out, you can look and see how much they had to dig out. But they had to do it, and they did it. And that also, so at that point in time, in this final enlargement, they lost 2 locks. So the new locks in High Falls all actually have 12 and a half foot of lift to compensate. And that's where we get the 108 locks. And in High Falls, they made them out of cut stone masonry. This is different from the hammered stone in that these are not mortared together. This is all just dry laid block. There's 6 locks in High Falls, 5 of which are in pretty good shape. One could be better, and the 6th one, all of the lining block has been taken out. But it's kind of fascinating because you can see what they did behind the block. There was ultimately 10 cut stone masonry locks. So lock number 1 and 2 in Eddyville and Creek locks were cut stone masonry. There's 6 in High Falls, and lock 22 in Accord. Here in High Falls, so you have 2 things. They've got 20 years of data. Every 10 years, you had to reline 110 locks worth of oak. In fact, in their annual report, and I think it's 39, they apologize for the cost of repairs. And I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, all that white oak, that was a lot of, And in High Falls, we have a lot of this wonderful Shawangum conglomerate stone. So they had the stone there. So they built these out of the local stone. That lock 22 was also built out of that local stone because it was right in the middle of a huge quarry, either side of the canal. And by the way, the canal was really important to these quarries because heavy products. One of the things why canals endured and why railroads took a while to take off was that it took railroads a while to be able to carry the kinds of weight they eventually did. And so canals kept their utility, the D&H, until '98 because they had the ability to carry great weights. But the bluestone industry and the cement industries really took advantage of the kind of capability water travel gave you. And also, I forget what the exact number is, but a single mule pulling or a draft animal pulling a wagon can pull a fraction of what they can on a boat, right? And you can come visit this. This is a part of our 5-block walk. This is right in front of our new museum. Let's see if I can get my next slide there. So here's moving up to our, so now they've rebuilt the canal. They're very successful. But it took 2 lock tenders, one on each side, to operate those miter gates. Those lock tenders were being paid, say, 30 to 40, depending on the period, a month to operate the locks for the D&H. 108, so 216 workers. So what we're seeing here is a little improvement that came about a little later. Let's close in a little quicker. So between 1853 and 1857, all the locks are converted to allow a single tender. Probably the last really major improvement they make to their canal. At this point, they're buying and building and leasing railroads, and they're putting more money into that. For them, getting the coal to market's the important thing. The canal is just the means to an end, excuse me. So this is Ben Hendricks at Lock 32 in Ellenville, now buried somewhere under a golf course. I know a surveyor. We're going to go find it hopefully this fall. I'm fortunate in meeting these people that can get me to places I couldn't get to otherwise. Here's Ben Hendricks. This was Sam Taylor's lock, so he owned the property around here. And he's sitting in the gear house. And by the way, Ed Leroy, you'll see in some drawings in this building where they start talking about this particular technology as being 1850. Ed was figuring it was part of the final enlargement. He didn't have easy access to that court case. I can say definitively because Russell Farnham Lord testifies in 1858 that between 53 and 57, they convert all the locks. One of the first ones was in High Falls. So I speculate that it would be that lock that I showed you because that was right in front of the Depew Tavern, which that's the year the canal company had bought that, 1850, they bought that building. And so if you're going to try a new technology, do it near one of your offices, right? So we know that, so half of this was patented. The half that did the low water end. So that gear house is sitting over the low water end. It couldn't be on the high water end because the boat's got to get out from under it, right? We know that this was designed for the D&H Canal. Interestingly enough, the D&H bought a different patent. Everybody okay? Yeah, great, Donna. The D&H Canal actually bought a different patent in this same period that they never implemented. And I don't know the story of it. It just happens to be in the archives of Minisink Valley Historical Society. While photographing Russell Farnham Lord's correspondence, I came across this patent, the purchase of it, and I looked up the patent. I still haven't figured out exactly what it did. But C.W. Williams lived in Port Jervis, so we know that this particular innovation was D&H specific. Just one part of it, though. And here's a better picture. I think this is Leroy's drawing. And this shows you how, so this little crank thing, we have a working model at the Canal Museum in High Falls you can physically see, and sometimes staff operates to show you exactly how this worked. So this is, now you don't need a person on either side to do each gate. One guy sits in that room. That'd be a lot easier. You don't have to run around as much. Get a little fatter though, huh? One guy could sit there and operate the one set of miter gates. And then on the other side, they used a drop gate. And here's a drawing. This was never patented. But this, all 108 locks were converted to that. So this lock here got that conversion somewhere in that time period as well. And here is Ed Leroy's drawing of how the entire thing worked. Kind of complicated. They've got a copy of it on the wall here, so if you want to study it more carefully. And if people, I can give my email address if people want any of these drawings or anything. I'm more than happy to share stuff with people. But this shows you the whole kind of Rube Goldberg thing. Interesting side note, and I'm sure I've discussed this with you, Paul. In this same period, the D&H Canal Company is buying rolls of wire rope from John Roebling, 500 foot, and they're dropping them at all the main offices. There are 5 different superintendents who each had a section of the canal. I speculate that wire, I can't figure out what else they'd be doing with it. I think that where they're showing chain in this drawing, I think wire rope was actually used for part of it. There's a local guy in High Falls who has a part of this lock mechanism that he's donating to the museum. I got to get on him to get it to me. And I look at it, and it looks like it's something to use drums, and it looks too small to accommodate chain. So I have a feeling that even though we're seeing chain in here, that actually wire rope was being used, Roebling's wire rope. And he was one of the wealthiest men in America because of his wire rope business. E.L. Henry painted some great paintings, and here you get to see you see the lock, the gear house. Interestingly enough, I just noticed when I was putting this together, they still have the miter gate handles on there. I'm curious, never having seen them, I don't see that in the pictures. Hard to say whether that was artistic license or a fact. Well, I can tell you one thing though, once there was a gear house there, those miter gates were gone on the other end, so that's a little minor mistake of Edward Lamson Henry's to draw those in. If you can see what I'm talking about in front of the boat, there's one of the handles that we saw on that earlier slide. 40 minutes, I'm doing pretty good, I think. Let's see here. Come on. So, I wanted to show you how a lock worked earlier in this presentation, but the drawings I had were based on that post 57 with the drop gates. These are from Manville Wakefield's great coal boats Tidewater. And so on the upper thing, you've got the water on the lock is up at the top level, and the boat's going to move in. The drop gate is, of course, dropped down so the boat can come through. And then that next image, now the boat is snubbed in, snubbing posts, the posts that they, and you'll see, I don't know if you've got any lock snubs here. I don't think you do. Somebody must have taken yours. We have a bunch of them in High Falls, and the lock snubs, you can see this deep, deep groove cut in from the wet sandy rope up and down. They were busy enough in the 1830s and the 1850s that places like High Falls were open 24 hours a day. That's how successful they were. So the boat gets snubbed in, and then they now lower the water. The water's drained out through the gates. There's little gates on it's a sluice gate, a little spot at the bottom of the miter gate that allows the water to go out. Lower paddle gate open, you can see there. Of course, the upper gate has to be secured now to keep the canal watered. And then the boat moves on out. So I know from court testimony, those small boats took 8 minutes to lock through, which astounds me that it was that quick. But the locks were only, so the boat was 9 and a half foot, I think. And the locks were 10 foot, 3 inches either side. They say like a hand in glove. Well, you wanted to minimize the loss of water and the amount of time. So these locks were just big enough for the boats that were traversing the canal. But after 1850, and here's a final, so the paddle gate, this shows you how they got the water out, how they wasted out the water so that the lock would drop. This is, I believe, Manville Wakefield's. This is in our collections. I'm not sure if that ever made it in his book or not, but you get to see it here. We know after 1850 that they could lock through in 4 minutes. You got to figure what's with that, right? Bigger boats, you think it's going to take longer. The locks are bigger now. The locks just went from being 70 foot long, 9.5 foot, 10 foot wide to 100 foot long, give or take, and 15 foot wide. But they could do what's called swelling out. Swelling out, you open the gate early, probably, given the math, 8 minutes, 4 minutes, probably when the water's about halfway down, you open the gate and the boat would just push on out. And then that means you could get out from under, it's hard to see because they've got a bridge in front of it. This is the pie lock, that great pie that Nancy made, if you folks had some of it, is based on, there was a grocery here where Mary Casey sold pies that were, canalers all couldn't wait to get to Lock 51. So this is the next lock down from here, 17 miles. It's hard to see. The gear house is behind that little, what we call a pony truss covered bridge, believe it or not. And here's this boat leaving the lock, presumably having been swelled out. They couldn't swell out on the smaller boats. They'd hoped that those boats would go out on the Hudson. They couldn't. Those boats would have swamped. But it sped up operations, and it was a regular feature. This way, you didn't have to monkey with the rope to get it under the gear house. You had to have a long pole and pull it in, so you needed to get the rope to pull the boat coming back in this lock, but you could swell out, and it sped up operations. But they were still open 24 hours a day, so they were getting, yeah.
So when they swelled out, obviously there was still water up against the gates. I guess at that point in time they had the mechanical.
But this is actually, think about it. It's a good question. The water, if it was on the one end, this is on this is on this side. So you remember I was saying it's like an arch. So in fact, the water helped the gates open. Now, had it been on the other end, and maybe that's why they had a drop gate rather than a miter gate. I never stopped to think about why didn't they use the same. Well, there were issues. You couldn't have had a gear house because the boat would have been above the level of the side of it would have been a lot more construction. You could make it work, but it would have been harder. So, but the other thing would have been getting the gates. You couldn't. Well, you wouldn't want to swell out. You want to swell out only on the low water side. Yeah. So here is a picture of the Depew Tavern company offices. This is lock 16. This is a boat locking through. Interesting side note, this appears to be an all-black crew, and we know that there were people of color work for substantially less money, and so the canal company was happy to employ them. It became kind of an opportunity. As I say, the workforce was throughout its history what we call marginalized peoples. A lot of immigrants, Irish and German, people of color, women and children, and there were more women and children than you might think. Remember, I'm saying how there's captains at 15 and 16, right? There were many, many girls, and we have even less information on them, women being the most marginalized, I would argue, to this day. You didn't get the vote till a half century after black men, girls. So this is just a great shot of my building. We actually have a copy of this in that place where you can see it. So we're winding along. I'm doing pretty good here, 45 minutes. I've timed it well. There were two other kinds of locks. In this wonderful crop, this is Eddyville. I do tours on the Hudson River Maritime Museum's solar-powered boat Solaris. I've been doing it for 3 years. We call it A Conversation with Bill Merchant. So I try and leave room for you folks. Why not? Limited success. And we actually go to where that bridge is and back, and I point out the industrial activity on the first Sunday of the month at 4 o'clock. They sell out. It's really a great gig. It's a lot of fun. There's not a bad day to go out on a solar-powered boat anywhere, I gotta say. It's like sailing without any of the work, But there were two different other kinds of locks, and since the title of this talk is Bagels and Locks, I figured let's go. So that pretty much covers exactly how the locks worked and the changes they went through. So to answer your question about the enlargements, those earlier enlargements were easy. You just raised the sides, you just added more material, and just made it taller. That's all you had to do, right? You had to think about it. They had to do the same thing with their aqueducts. They just made them taller to accommodate, a foot taller. Pretty easy. Would do it in the off season. They're closed down from December to March. So
that's obviously when they in the off season when they relined everything.
Yeah. That work was done. Although
it was pretty severe back then.
Yeah. But those immigrants would work for $1 a day at any time of year. So sometimes I'm sure the weather closed them down, but they did manage to do it. They also, by 1850, we know from the historic record from correspondence with Russell Farnham Lord, they owned a steam-operated dredge that could bring material up while the canal was filled with water. And so, but the final enlargement, all the locks were rebuilt. One side stayed in place, but it had to be taller. The miter gates, it had to be longer. So when I go out in the field, I can go and say, oh, that's the 1825 side, because I'll see the evidence of the miter gates. The other side had to be completely rebuilt 5 foot to the side, correct? Interestingly enough, this lock doesn't show any sign of the enlargement. So this tells me that for whatever reasons, and I may or may not figure that out through the research I'm doing, this lock was completely rebuilt. So when we go back out there, if you folks want to, I can't tell you which side was the original. This entire lock was rebuilt sometime after 1850. So guard locks and way locks, we'll start with guard locks. When you have so the canal tried not to open into natural waterways. The D&H Canal crossed the Lackawaxen River just outside of Honesdale, but just briefly, basically just crossed it. They hit tidewater at creek locks. That part of Rosendale got that name because locks number 2 and 3, right in succession there, lock 2 locked out to the Rondout Creek, and the canal then traversed about 3 miles of the actual Rondout. It was the one section of the river they could use in both directions. But when you open, and for the most part, rather than opening into bodies of water, you built aqueducts. They had 20 aqueducts that they had to cross, and they also had culverts for smaller bodies of water. Guard locks are special locks where the natural waterway end is about, I'm not sure whether it's 3 to 6 foot. It's taller to protect it from high water, usually in the spring, during freshets and the like. And this is a picture postcard of the guard lock. So you got to Creek Locks, you went 3 miles, and then here you had to get around the Eddyville Dam. And this is the guard lock. This is extant. It's still in the ground. The Canal Society owns it. It's buried. There are people who have approached us about, I'd love to see it opened out again and celebrated. But here's an image of a guard lock. There was also one, had to be 2 at the Delaware. There had to be 1 or 2 in Holmesdale. And they're just special locks whose, as I say, natural waterway end, it's got a taller wall on it to kind of protect the lock from being decimated when you had a lot of water and debris at times of high water. But the waylocks are kind of even more interesting. In 1850, they contract with the Fairbanks Scale Company in Vermont to have them build 2 scales. These are scales big enough to take a 90-foot long boat, carrying 130 tons of coal, weighing itself, I don't know what the tare it was, but got to be 5-6 tons, if not more. Big enough to actually accommodate those. And of course, so they were buying one for their operation and for PA Coal. PA Coal very early on was almost just a subsidiary of the D&H. It's funny to see that it went so south because it was really like a friendly rival, as if to say, look, we're not the only game in town, you got that one. It backfired on them. Early American capitalism. So here is a picture in 1922 of the Waylock in Eddyville. Today there's a house built over most of it. And I only, in doing this presentation, discovered that I thought that the boat went into the entire building, but as we'll see, they didn't. And you can see there's a front and there's that wooden structure. The boat stuck out, and we'll see a drawing that'll make that clearer. Here's a colored postcard, and you can see, it's hard to see, but that red building, no, actually, the Waylock is the white building all the way over on your right there. And just for fun, I love this picture. This is lock number 1, so the Waylock would be to the left of that image right there. But then the other Waylock, so the D&H company, they were smart. They didn't weigh the boat till you're almost to the Rondout. You're almost to the Hudson River, right? Because who knows what's going to happen on that 5-day trip. You probably burned some coal. One source claims that they weren't allowed to. I don't believe it. It didn't matter if they weren't allowed to. There's stories of kids harassing the canalers so they'd throw coal at them and then the kids would get the coal. And if you were poor, that would be a way to help your family heat the home, wouldn't it? For some reason, the PA Coal Company weighed their boats at the beginning in the town of Hawley. So they had a Waylock in Hawley. And here's Ed Leroy's drawing. And until I was doing this presentation, I hadn't realized that this was the configuration. This drawing was really helpful. But it's amazing to think that they would make a scale that could, calculate that thing. So you get a boat, they'd know the tare, the unladen weight of the boat, and you get weighed in the Waylock, and then you're credited X amount. It was about $1 a ton at the peak. Yeah.
Question: were they weighed for compliance in terms of what they could carry, or they were weighed for the?
They were weighed to credit you how much coal did you carry.
For their fee.
Yeah. So the canal company early on, they ran everything. They quickly abandoned that. How do you keep track of all these the boats and the mules? And they would have mule stations, and they'd have hoagies, mule drivers at each station. It was pandemonium, and probably the stuff got stolen, and it just was hard to manage. So they started very quickly to sell you the boat, and you got credited X amount. So you became an independent contractor. This is why people of color, it was a real opportunity, because you were the captain of your own ship. You had some autonomy. You were buying the boat from the company. Some people bought boats and then hired crews, but you were buying the boat, and every load you did at its peak, you got $1 a ton. So each trip you made was $130. About $20 came out to pay for the boat. So the boats had numbers. That's how the canal company, they were having them made. Over 100 boat builders on the canal, because the numbers of boats they needed. The boats only lasted about a decade if you were lucky. You had a number. Once you paid the boat off, you gave it a name. So that picture of the little Freddie down there, we know, in the back wall, at probably I think that's probably the Delaware Aqueduct. That's the Cameron family with their 3 sons, George, Matty, and Freddie. So the little Freddie perhaps was named for their favorite son, or maybe their firstborn, who knows. So the canal company, every year, they knew the weight of your boat. It had its number or name. And then you got to well, in the case of PA Coal, they waited at the beginning. In the case of the D&H company proper, they waited at Eddyville. And you had to pump all the water out. You can only have an inch of water. They're not going to pay you coal money for water weight. And you paid off your boat and got, as I say, at the peak it was $1 a ton. By the 1880s, because of railroads, it drops to 60 cents a ton. And yet the record tells us they were turning away hundreds. People still wanted that work. It's my contention that's when we start seeing images like that one in the back, family groups. So I have a lot of images of families running boats, and that was probably the latter era when railroads were now efficient enough and the canal was paying you less money, you know. So here's an image of that waylock in Holly. And so you can see there's no boat in there, I don't think. Yeah, no, because we'd be seeing the boat, and there's no water in it at the moment from what I can see in that image there. So I'm winding down now, but since here we are at the Boothroyd dry dock and Lock 50, this is an image, I just gave a copy of it to Nancy and to Sean. This is this site. Nancy and I, when I brought it to him, what was it, 2 weeks ago or a week ago, we were trying to figure what that building was. We have pictures of the Boothroyd house in the era. That building there, all that's left of it is the cellar hole right over here. But this is the latter era two boat. There was two dry docks here. There was one, there was a single boat one, possibly just before the enlargement. The one that's here now accommodates two boats, and here's a great picture of people building a boat, possibly some Boothroyds, right in that, in the dry dock right here. So it's not a lock, but since here we are at the site of it, I wanted to show you people that picture. D&H Canal Company, coal company, remember, by 1898, now the canal is not finally economically feasible. So they just sell it. They sell it for pennies on the dollar because they've got an extensive rail network. As I say, 1872, peak coal on the canal, 1.4 million tons. They own or control railroads from New York City to Montreal. There was much a railroad. I'm overdue to parse how much tonnage was at that point going on the railway. So they just take canal out of the name, sell off the canal, and continue being a very successful coal company. Probably the middle of the 20th century when oil supplants coal for heating purposes, they become a freight line. By 1990, they go belly up, they go bankrupt. Now they're a wholly owned subsidiary of Expo Rail, why Paul had to go to Toronto to get those maps for us. But what it was Montreal then, it's Toronto now. So they actually sold the company. It was Montreal originally, and then by the time we got them, we chased them between there because somebody else bought out Expo Rail. But yeah, thank you for that correction there. Not that the rest of us care, but you know. And then I think we're probably, oh wait, I just want a little ad, you know. So I'm the historian curator and a deputy director here at the D&H Canal Historical Society. This is a great image, probably in the 1900s before they filled in the canal. This is the 1797 Depew Tavern and home to my museum. If you enjoyed this lecture, we've got a lot of content, over 100 video on D&H TV. This one will join it at some point. This one will also be available at the Mama Kading Library once Bill, our excellent videographer, is done doing his editing magic. We've got a lot of we've got a map of all the publicly accessible parts of the D&H. I have a lot of those 420, not all of them, but I have all the locks and major features on this map. It's a Google map. At this point, I'd have to take a shout out to the Open Space Institute because they're going to be taking the New York O&W Railway and building a wonderful trail system. We in New York State love our trails. The Empire State Trail, 220 million has it been? We have wonderful trails here. As part of that project, they're going to build a continuous towpath, well, almost continuous towpath trail from Route 42 in Port Jervis all the way to Accord. I'm very excited. 67 miles of that 108-mile will be a continuous trail. Open Space Institute does wonderful work. If you're interested in taking the survey, I've got a QR code here. Over 1,000 people have already weighed in. Overwhelmingly popular support. Very little negative. I haven't seen the results myself. I'm working with the Open Space Institute on this project. Really exciting for D&H fans and aficionados. They do a great job. They'll maintain the historic features. They'll make them publicly accessible in ways that Sullivan gets a shout out. Sullivan keeps most of their D&H trails open. Good on you, Sullivan County. Orange County, for whatever reasons, owns it but doesn't really do much with it. So this is going to be a really wonderful opportunity for all of us. I've been in a lot of the sections of it, but you have to really know how to get to them. This will all change. There'll be signage. It'll be well maintained. Very exciting development for us on the D&H Canal.
This was fantastic. You talked a lot about the engineering feat that was the canal, but I have a two-part question. One was the logistics, so the operations. It seems like you only get one boat going one way at a time, and there was a huge number of them. How did they do the scheduling or dispatching each way? And then what was the economics? Because it seems, based on all the money that went into it, how could they have, over the course of those 70 years, funded and made that profitable with simply just selling boats?
Well, they were selling the coal, so it's a transportation network to get their product to market.
So they owned the coal, they also owned...
But yes, they're coal mines. So the Wirtz brothers get those mines in northeastern Pennsylvania, where 3/4 of all the world's coal is, and then they start trying to find markets for it. They actually start, they hire a guy to buy land for them so people wouldn't know what those smart Quaker, sharp Quaker businessmen were up to. And that became the basis. They were Carbondale. They named the town. I love how they named places back then. They named the town where their mines were Carbondale. It was all about getting that coal to market. They pay 30% on their stock, and I think it's 1863. Some of that may have had to do with the Civil War, but immensely successful stock. Largest coal company in America. You wanted D&H stock. You wanted to have it, and the canal was wide enough for two-way traffic. So that original 32-foot wide prism, two 9.5-foot boats could pass easily. The only trick was the laden boat was always on the berm side, opposite the towpath, and they had to stop. The mule driver would let the rope drop, and then the light boat could just easily go across it. So one-way traffic was all of the locks, only a single, and in fact, at times of low water, they wouldn't let you fill the lock without there being a boat in it. So you might have 5 boats over there, but if you didn't have one coming here, you waited. They eventually bought reservoirs and just they made their reservoirs bigger. They found more ways to get water into it. But at bridges, so you have a bridge site right here. The road you drove across was a bridge in the historic era. They just took the stone and filled in the bed, basically. Bridges were shorter, so they were one-way traffic. Aqueducts were one-way traffic, and locks were one-way traffic. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Some of the aqueducts, some of the shorter ones, like the one over the Pine Kill and the one over the Beaver Brook, were wide enough to allow 2 boats to cross. So that was, it was a two-way traffic. Took you about 10 days, and they were constantly going in both.
And did they have a way to alert someone that boat was coming in the opposite direction?
Oh, you mean like the horns and yeah. You were obliged by the rules of navigation to sound a horn. So we have on display a conch shell. You can, if you know what you're doing, you can make a horn, and tin horns. You had to let them know you were coming. I got a question in the back.
Yes. One of your early slides, you showed the canal opened in October of 1828.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in the wintertime, the canal froze and was closed. When was it closed? Like December through March?
Exactly.
Okay.
Typical navigation.
Now, New York City being the big market for Pennsylvania coal, the coal going through the canal, did they stockpile it in New York City? They built an island dock like they have in Miranda. They built one of those.
Yeah, you got as much coal over there. They had a lot of coal in Honesdale all the time. There's pictures of huge piles there. I just sent, because somebody asked this question, I just sent Sean and Nancy something I came across in my research notes of the 4 offices they had in Manhattan. But then in 1858, they buy 14 acres of land in Weehawken, New Jersey, and that becomes their coal depot. And so they would stockpile coal. Yeah. Well,
obviously, your greatest demand for coal is going to be during the winter. I mean, industrial needs would be year-round, but for heating purposes, winter is going to be the biggest demand, so they have to stockpile enough for all the needs from New York.
Exactly, if they wanted to sell, or people were, people I think also knew to tuck in their coal early. It's like, did you all lock in your heating oil this year? I know I did. A similar thing. You know you're going to need this resource. Yeah, that's why railroads were destined to overtake it. In a certain way, it's incredible that it made them money for as long as it did, isn't it? Right? But yeah. And another question here.
When they were building the canal, was eminent domain involved?
Not at all. interestingly enough. And I had a little thing with the late Stephen Sky, and I finally was able to find because some people speculated, so their charter in New York gave them the right to purchase. Look, people wanted the canal to come through. As I said, some landowners gave the land. There were negotiated things. If somebody was playing hardball, I don't know how they did it, but I know there was negotiated. But there's a letter, I have a letter from Russell Farnham Lord in a correspondence that he wrote where he says explicitly, all of the lands on the D&H Canal were by voluntary secession. So there was no need for eminent domain. And as I say, it was a matter amongst scholars, the late Stephen Sky. He and I would go back and forth nicely, and I finally found this letter and sent it to him and said, Stephen, they didn't need eminent domain, you know. And we have no primary source that says there was eminent domain. So
Now, the lakes in the Rock Hill area, Maston, Wanasing, how I call them,
yeah,
that supplied water to the Neversink, which emptied into the canal, which sluiced into it.
they
So
spent.
that water that went into the canal in that location, where did that water use, was it used going south or north?
It was used everywhere. You know, once the water got into the canal system, the biggest thing, you got 17 miles here, and they had a lot of problems. In fact, in the final enlargement, it took them until 52 to get 6 foot of water. For one period, I know they'd get to Cutterbackville, they'd unload a third of the load because they didn't have enough water in this 17-mile stretch. The canalers would come here, they'd unload another third here, Lord knows where it was put. Then they go back, reload, and, you know, but they did it. They did it. So, but they didn't just, so I know the D&H owned a big lake that fed the Neversink. Do you know Lake Minnewaska, or Lake Owasting in Minnewaska State Park? Yeah. The D&H owned that.
They use that water?
Yeah, they used that water. They had to own, it was called Long Pond, and they pulled it because the Peterskill was a feeder, and I can show you the feeder race to this day, if you're in that part of Accord. Yankee and Wolf Lake were connected, and they used the Pinekill to take the water in. So there were various, but you're right, all of those, they had 25 reservoirs across their entire thing. What's the name of that lake outside Wallenpaupack? Lake Wallenpaupack was a feeder. They got the right to pull water out of that. You know, I like to say anytime there was water higher in the canal, they figured out ways to get the water in the canal, you know.
So Wallenpaupack was built initially to supply water?
That I don't know. You know, in fact, I just drove past there on Wednesday and realized, oh, this is a man-made lake. I'm driving, you know, I'm below the level of the dirt dam on the northern end, I guess it is. I'm not you know, thanks for the question. I'll look into that. I'm not sure the history of Wallenpaupack. Yeah, John.
Who were the workers who built the canal?
Irishmen.
All Irishmen?
Pretty much. I did a lot of research.
They then built the railroads,
Yeah.
obviously. Port Jervis was a major rail hub at one time. Did the railroads put the canal out of business, basically?
No, the canal, because, so a lot,
What I'm getting at is,
you know, in the largest sense, yes.
the D&H company had a choice to stay with the canal or go into the railroad business.
Well, you know, it's never as simple as you might want to do it. They ran the first steam locomotive in the Western Hemisphere on their gravity railroad in 1829. They are buying and leasing railroads throughout, you know, so it's not an either or. They operated a railroad and a canal. At a certain point, the railroads got more vigorous. Of course, they could supply coal in the winter, so you could say that was predestined, but it was much more organic and much slower. It was much more gradual. You know, yeah. No, exactly. You know, when I started working on the register, the two excellent historians, Bob Wise and Seth Hinshaw, on one of the first trips said, so when did they turn into a railroad? And it's, in our minds, we like sort of a simple solution, but in fact, they just wanted to sell coal. So they had a canal to sell coal, and then as railroads were ascending, they started buying railroad lines, they started leasing railroad lines. As I say, 72, the canal is moving the most coal it ever moves, but they're also just as big a railroad. They're now shipping their coal on the railroads as well. So it was this very organic, gradual, as railroads were able to take on tonnage. So we don't have any pictures of people on what we call packet boats for mail and passengers. We've got paintings, and I can say definitively, I could show you in the historic record the mention of many, the orange packet burned, was it Wurtsboro in 1850, I think it was. But we don't have any images because photography hadn't developed. Railroads captured passengers first because it took them longer to develop the capability of great weight. And so there's this very gradual thing where America goes from canals to railroads. And to this day, the Erie Canal exists for really big things. So about 5 years ago, you could have seen a turbine from GE that came across the Erie, going down the Hudson River. You could go wave at it or whatever. Right now on social media, I see there's a pedestrian bridge going somewhere on the Erie. So canals still have their utility. It's just, in America, canals, we had canal fever. This was a special time where in this land, because of the way it developed differently because of the native cultures, and they were amazing cultures. You know, what a lot of us learned in school is completely wrong. Read 1491 by Charles Mann, fascinating read. Canals had a special utility in America for that first 50 to 75 years as the railroad business ascended. Does that answer your question, John?
It's got me thinking.
Yeah, well, you know, and isn't that wonderful? This is what I love about, you know, I go and do research and I get answers, but I always get more questions, right? And I love doing this sort of outreach with people because you people have great ideas. This is why I say go ahead and interrupt me. I learned something, or you get me to think about something. Now I have to figure out Wallenpaupack. Why was it built, you know? Any other questions, or? Sure.
So the Erie Canal was completed in 1825.
Correct.
Were any of the workers that previously worked on the Erie Canal, did they migrate down here to work?
It's very possible. Well, certainly the engineers did. You know, those gentlemen, John Jervis, amazing engineer. James McEntee, he's got a really fascinating life. If I were to write a book of somebody, McEntee did a lot of amazing stuff. And James Archibald, who becomes the railroad guy, he takes the gravity railroad and improves it, rejiggers it 3, 4, 5 times. I don't know how many under James Archibald, but these were all people. But the Erie Canal, as I understand it, didn't use Irish labor so much originally because there were so many people in Western New York who needed the work. So I think it's Archibald who gets a job building the canal on his family's farm and we actually have his mother's letters are available. I've been reading, I'll have to get a copy of them. So initially, no, certainly workers, the boats and some of the traffic and you know, the boats could in some instances work on both canals. But the Erie Special, it used Irish labor much more in their enlargements, and that canal did five major enlargements, if memory serves.
And the methodology was predominantly pick and shovel and mules and...
Yep, exactly. One source claims, one historian unfootnoted, special place in hell for historians who don't footnote. Right, Paul? One source claims that it was a well-known aphorism in the canal era that all you need to build a canal is a pick, a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and an Irishman. I love it even if it's not true. Even if it's lore, you want to go tell it, yeah.
That was it, it was all handwork.
It was all handwork, yeah. Black powder, you don't get dynamite until 1869. Philip Noble invents dynamite. Prior to that, it's black powder. It's that very dangerous, volatile stuff. Basically gunpowder, you know. No, very rudimentary technology, and yet they built it on time, on budget. A technological wonder, and a really important American story, you know. I know I had other questions.
Is there another company that tried to buy the D&H afterwards, that attempted another business, or?
So let's see, the Erie bought part of it, the southern end of it. I'm not sure what happened in the Pennsylvania stretches. Samuel Kirkendall bought for $20,000. They say he bought the entire canal. I don't credit that. And that's something I'll have to do some research someday on. And he buys it in '99, and he operates boats. So I have stuff I bought on eBay where the hardware company in Ellenville's going, oh no, we're going out of business. And then I got cards going, well, wait, we're back in business. Kirkendall buys it, and he operates it from Wurtsboro to Tidewater for 2 years. And there's speculation in the press that he bought it for the railroad interests. Indeed, he sells from Ellenville to Accord to the New York O&W, and they build their rail line directly over the D&H bed. And then Kirkendall, he's buying up natural cement plants, and he creates the Consolidated Rosendale Cement Company. He operates the canal, and the people after him. He dies in 1914. The canal operates from between High Falls and Rosendale, from Coles Basin to Tidewater, until 1917. And all the earlier books have got this wrong. It's now Stephen Blauweiss's book has got the right date. And I can say this definitively from research I've done, from documents that I've got. And that was just to bring, now they're bringing the coal in from the Hudson River, from the other end, to fire the kilns to make the cement, to ship it back out. It's my contention that America's entry into the First World War in 1917 was the death knell. All of a sudden, the labor pool gets drafted, and that industry goes, and that's the end of the true end of the D&H Canal. To me, it starts in 1812, and it endures in some shape or other until 1917.
When did Portland Cement take over?
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a Portland cement factory on the Rondout from 1865, one of the earliest ones. It was around the turn of the 20th century. And one source, Kingston historian Taylor Bruck, an able historian, read somewhere in a primary source that the main reason that Portland cement, so Portland cement, for those of you who don't know, natural cement, the stuff here in New York State, is a stone that's got everything you need. If you burn it correctly, it calcines, it changes chemically, makes the strongest cement known to man, like the Roman cement, which wasn't a natural product, but also was hydraulic. We now know that these cements are self-healing, which is why they last so long. Portland, it's a recipe. So the dolomitic limestone, what natural cement's made of, has got the right proportion of clay, of magnesium, of the trace elements that you need, that it just makes this amazing product. Portland, you go and you get some limestone, does any limestone, and then you get a product, you get some clay, you get the materials, it's like a recipe. But Taylor's told me, and I've got to find the primary on this, he claims that Portland cement, so we know the ASME rewrote the standards for cement so as to favor Portland. Well, it dried quicker, right? So contractors liked it better. But he contends, he read somewhere, that Portland descended because you can demolish it. And if any of you, I personally have tried to get rid of some Rosendale cement on my property. I've rattled my back teeth with a rented backhoe or a jackhammer, didn't put a mark on it. Moved my drainage somewhere else, basically. So I really, not only is it sort of a fun idea, but I think it's absolutely correct. You know. Other questions? Well, I got one more slide, and then there we go.